My name is Matthew Harris, and I'm a truck driver in California. I've hauled freight through every stretch of desert highway, but nothing prepared me for what I saw on Highway 58 that night. The road was empty, the stars were hidden, and the shadows moved in ways they shouldn't have. What climbed into my truck still haunts every mile I drive. And if you think this is just another ghost story, I promise you, it isn't. Before I tell you everything, make sure you like this video, subscribe to Horror Silence, and leave a comment. Because once you hear what followed me out of the desert, you'll never look at an empty highway the same way again. For 15 years, I'd been behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, crossing every state in the continental United States. But California was my home route. I knew every mile marker, every truck stop, every way station from San Diego to the Oregon border. I could drive Highway 58 between Bakersfield and Barstow with my eyes closed. Hell, some nights I practically did. It's a lonely stretch of asphalt that cuts through the Mojave Desert, connecting the Central Valley to the high desert. And in all my years driving that route, I'd seen everything. Dust storms that could strip paint off your rig, winter nights so cold your diesel would gel, summer days where the heat mirages made you see lakes that weren't there. But I'd never seen anything like what happened on October 23rd, 2024. I was driving for a Consolidated Freight Systems, had been for the past 8 years. Good company, decent pay, and they didn't mind that I preferred the night runs. There's something peaceful about the highway at night. Fewer cars, no construction delays, just you and the road and whatever's playing on the CB radio. That particular night, I was hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Reno. Nothing unusual, just another routine delivery that I'd done probably 100 times before. I'd left the distribution center in Carson around 9 p.m., and by the time I merged onto Highway 58 near Bakersfield, it was just past 11:30. The radio was playing some old country song, the kind that makes you think about roads you've traveled and places you've been. And I was settling into that comfortable rhythm that long-distance drivers know, the gentle sway of the cab, the steady hum of the engine, the hypnotic sweep of headlights across the center line. That's when I noticed the fog rolling in. Now, fog isn't unusual in that part of California, especially in October, when the temperature starts dropping at night. But this fog was different. It was thick, almost oily looking, and it seemed to be moving against the wind. I'd been watching the weather reports, and there was no mention of fog in the forecast. Hell, it had been clear as glass when I left LA, not a cloud in the sky. But suddenly, the fog was everywhere, creeping across the highway like something alive, reducing my visibility to maybe 50 feet in front of my headlights. I slowed down to about 40 miles per hour, turned on my flashers, and reached for the CB radio to warn other drivers. But all I got was static, dead static, like the kind you hear when there's no signal at all. That should have been my first warning that something was wrong. But I've been driving long enough to know that CB radios can be finicky, especially in bad weather. So I kept driving, following the reflective markers on the roadside, trusting my experience and the GPS mounted on my dashboard to keep me on course. The fog seemed to be getting thicker with every mile, and the temperature inside the cab started dropping. I reached over to adjust the heater, but the controls weren't responding. The fan was running, but only cold air was coming through the vents. Cold air that smelled like... I still don't know how to describe that smell. It was like wet earth and old flowers, the kind of smell you might encounter in a cemetery after a rainstorm. I'd been driving in the fog for maybe 20 minutes when I saw them. At first, it was just shapes in the distance, indistinct forms that could have been anything: road signs, abandoned vehicles, maybe just tricks of light and shadow. But as I got closer, the shapes resolved into 3 figures standing on the shoulder of the highway. A man, a woman, and a small child, all of them facing the road with their thumbs extended. Hitchhikers. In the middle of the Mojave Desert, at nearly midnight, in fog so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face. Now, I want to be clear about something. In 15 years of driving, I had never, not once, picked up a hitchhiker. It's against company policy, it's dangerous, and, frankly, most of the people you see thumbing rides on remote highways are either running from something or carrying something you don't want in your truck. But there was something about this family that made me slow down. Maybe it was the child. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, and the thought of a little girl standing on a desert highway in the middle of the night bothered me more than I cared to admit. Or maybe it was the way they were dressed. Clean clothes, the kind you'd wear to church or a family dinner, not the kind of clothes you'd expect to see on people who had been stranded on a highway for any length of time. I pulled over, about 100 feet past them, and sat there for a moment, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. Through my side mirror, I could see them walking toward the truck, moving with a strange, synchronized pace that seemed almost rehearsed. The man was tall and thin, wearing a dark suit that looked expensive even in the dim light of my running lights. The woman was shorter. Darkness of the fog. The man approached the passenger side of the cab and knocked on the window. When I rolled it down, he smiled, a perfect, white-toothed smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and said, "Thank you so much for stopping. We've been stranded here for hours." His voice was smooth and polite with just a hint of a southern accent, the kind of voice you'd expect to hear from a preacher or a politician. "Our car broke down about 5 miles back, and we've been walking ever since. My wife called for a tow truck, but they said it would be morning before they could get out here." I looked past him at the woman and child. The woman was smiling too, that same perfect smile, and she gave me a little wave. The little girl just stared at me with huge dark eyes that seemed to reflect the light from my headlights in a way that human eyes shouldn't. "Where are you folks headed?" I asked, though I was already reaching for the door lock release. Something about their situation tugged at whatever decency I had left after years of seeing the worst of humanity on America's highways. "Barstow," the man replied. "We have family there. We were supposed to arrive hours ago. They're probably worried sick." He glanced back at his wife and daughter, and I noticed that they both nodded in perfect unison, as if they were responding to some signal I couldn't see. "We'd be eternally grateful if you could give us a ride. We can pay for gas, of course." Against every instinct I'd developed over 15 years of driving, against company policy, against my own common sense, I unlocked the passenger door. "Climb on up," I said. "I'm heading right through Barstow anyway." The man helped his wife and daughter up into the cab first, and I noticed that none of them seemed to have any luggage, not even a purse or a wallet. When I mentioned this, the woman spoke for the first time, her voice as smooth and pleasant as her husband's. "We left everything in the car," she said. "We were only planning to walk until we found help." Her explanation made sense, but something about the way she said it, the carefully measured cadence of her words, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Once they were all settled in the sleeper compartment behind my seat, it's illegal for passengers to ride there while the vehicle is in motion, but it was the only place they could all fit. I pulled back onto the highway and resumed my journey toward Barstow. The fog seemed to be clearing slightly, though I still couldn't see more than a few hundred feet ahead, and the CB radio was still producing nothing but static. I tried to make conversation, the way you do when you're stuck in a small space with strangers for what's going to be at least an hour and a half. I asked them about their family in Barstow, what they did for work, how long they'd lived in California. The man did most of the talking, giving answers that were polite but somehow generic, the kind of responses that could Apply to anyone, anywhere. He said they'd lived in California for a long time, that he worked in business, that their family in Barstow were good people. The woman would occasionally add a word or two of agreement, and the little girl remained completely silent. About 30 minutes into the drive, I started to notice things that didn't add up. First, there was the matter of their clothes. Even though they claimed to have been walking on a dusty desert highway for hours, their clothing was immaculate. Not a wrinkle, not a speck of dust, not even a hint of perspiration, despite the fact that October nights in the Mojave can still be quite warm. Second, I realized I hadn't heard any of them breathing. In the close confines of a truck cab, you become acutely aware of the sounds other people make. Breathing, shifting position, the rustle of clothing. But from the 3 passengers in my sleeper compartment, there was nothing. Complete silence, as if they weren't there at all. The third thing I noticed was the temperature. Despite having 3 additional bodies in an enclosed space, the cab was getting colder. My breath was starting to fog, and I could feel the chills seeping through my jacket. When I reached for the heater controls again, I found that they were already turned to maximum heat, but the air coming through the vents was ice cold. "Is it getting cold back there?" I called over my shoulder, but the man just replied that they were perfectly comfortable, thank you very much. It was around that time that I glanced in my rearview mirror and got the shock of my life. The little girl was staring directly at me, her huge dark eyes fixed on mine in the mirror. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that I could see right through her. She was translucent, like looking at someone through frosted glass, and behind her I could clearly see the back wall of the sleeper compartment. I jerked my eyes back to the road, convinced that I was seeing things, maybe suffering from fatigue or the effects of driving in fog for too long. But when I looked in the mirror again, she was still there, still staring, still translucent. That's when I noticed that I couldn't see the man or woman in the mirror at all. Even though I could hear the man talking, even though I could sense their presence in the cab behind me, they cast no reflection in any of the mirrors. None of them did, except for the little girl. And she looked like a ghost. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel, and I had to fight the urge to slam on the brakes and demand that they get out of my truck immediately. But we were still in the middle of nowhere, still surrounded by fog, and some rational part of my mind. The little girl spoke for the first time, her voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Mr. Harris, are we almost home?" The use of my name stopped me cold. I hadn't introduced myself to these people, hadn't told them my name, and it wasn't printed anywhere visible in the cab. My commercial driver's license was in my wallet, my employee ID was clipped to the sun visor, but both were facing away from the passenger compartment. "How do you know my name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a moment of silence from the back of the cab, and then the man's voice, smooth as ever. "You told us when we got in, Mr. Harris. Don't you remember?" But I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't told them my name. In fact, I distinctly remembered not introducing myself, which was unusual for me. I'm generally polite to a fault, especially with passengers, even unauthorized ones. That's when I started to suspect that I was in serious trouble. I began looking for a place to pull over, some excuse to get these people, or whatever they were, out of my truck. But every time I slowed down or showed any sign of stopping, I could feel their attention focusing on me like a physical weight. The little girl would whisper, "We're not home yet, Mr. Harris." And the temperature in the cab would drop another few degrees. The man would remind me, in that perfectly polite voice, that they were so grateful for my help and that they wouldn't want to inconvenience me by stopping before Barstow. As we continued down Highway 58, I started to notice that the mile markers weren't advancing the way they should. I'd been driving this route for years. I knew it like the back of my hand. But markers that should have indicated our steady progress toward Barstow seemed to be repeating or appearing out of sequence or sometimes not appearing at all. My GPS was showing our location as a blank spot on the map, as if we were driving through an area that didn't exist. The radio remained dead static, and I began to realize that my cell phone had no signal either, despite the fact that this stretch of highway normally had excellent coverage. Time seemed to be behaving strangely as well. My dashboard clock showed 12:15 a.m., then 12:03, then 1:47, then back to 11:58. Sometimes the digital display would flicker and show times that couldn't possibly be correct, like 25:73 or 88:91. I found myself losing track of how long we'd been driving. It felt like hours, but it also felt like we'd just left the spot where I'd picked them up. The fog outside seemed to be getting thicker instead of clearing, and I began to have the unsettling feeling that we weren't making any real progress at all, that we were trapped in some kind of loop, driving the same stretch of highway over and over again. The little girl's whispers became more frequent and more disturbing. She would say things like, "We've been waiting so long to get home, aren't you?" And, most unsettling of all, "The others tried to leave us, but you won't do that, will you?" When I asked what she meant by "the others," the man quickly interjected that she was just tired and confused, that children sometimes said strange things when they were upset. But the little girl continued to stare at me in the rearview mirror with those dark, penetrating eyes, and I began to understand that whatever was happening to me had happened to other drivers before. It was then that I started seeing them, the other trucks. At first, they were just shapes in the fog, indistinct forms that appeared and disappeared at the edge of my headlight beams. But as the night wore on, they became more solid, more real. Other 18-wheelers driving parallel to mine, sometimes on roads that shouldn't have existed in the empty desert. I could see the drivers in their cabs, illuminated by the glow of their instrument panels, and they all had the same expression of terror and confusion that I was feeling. Some of them were frantically working their radios, others were pounding on their steering wheels, and a few were just sitting there, with thousand-yard stares, as if they'd given up hope entirely. I tried to get the attention of one of the other drivers, flashing my lights and honking my horn, but he didn't respond. It was as if he couldn't see me, or as if we existed in different dimensions that only occasionally intersected. That's when I realized that these might not be other drivers experiencing what I was experiencing right now. These might be the drivers who had come before me, the ones the little girl had referred to as the others, trapped forever in this nightmarish loop on a highway that existed outside of normal space and time. The woman spoke up for the second time, her voice cutting through my growing panic like a blade. "You're a good man, Mr. Harris. We knew you would help us." There was something different about her voice now, something that made my skin crawl. It was still pleasant and polite, but underneath the surface politeness, I could hear something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting a very long time to be satisfied. "We chose you specifically," she continued, "because you have such a kind heart. The others, well, the others weren't quite right for what we needed." I wanted to ask what they needed, but I was afraid of the answer. Instead, I found myself asking, "How long have you been out here? How long have you been waiting on that highway?" The question seemed to hang in the air for a long time before the man answered, and when he did, his voice had lost some of its artificial warmth. "Since 1987, he said. "October 23rd, 1987. We've been waiting 37 years for the right driver, the right truck, the right opportunity to complete our journey. October 23rd, 1987. The date meant something to me, but I couldn't quite place it. Then it hit me. I'd seen that newspaper archives I'd browsed during long layovers at truck stops. There had been an accident on Highway 58 in October of 1987. A family killed when their car skidded off the road in heavy fog. A man, his wife, and their 7-year-old daughter. They'd been driving to Barstow to visit relatives for the little girl's birthday. Their bodies had been found 3 days later, thrown clear of the vehicle which had gone over an embankment and burst into flames. "You're dead," I whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of the engine. "You're all dead. You died 37 years ago." The silence that followed my statement was absolute and terrifying. Even the engine seemed to quiet down, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then the little girl laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone, and said, "Dead is such an ugly word, Mr. Harris. We prefer to think of ourselves as unfinished." That's when I tried to stop the truck. I pressed down on the brake pedal as hard as I could, but nothing happened. The truck continued to roll forward at exactly the same speed, as if my foot wasn't even connected to the braking system. I tried to downshift, but the transmission wouldn't respond. I tried to turn the steering wheel, but it was locked in place, keeping us pointed straight ahead down the foggy highway. I was no longer in control of my own vehicle. They were. "We're so close now," the woman said, her voice taking on an excited, almost giddy quality. "We can feel home just ahead. After all these years of waiting, of watching other drivers turn away or abandon us before we could complete the journey, we finally found someone with the strength and the compassion to see us through to the end." I realized then that this wasn't just about giving them a ride to Barstow. This was about something much worse, something that involved the completion of a journey that had been interrupted 37 years ago by their death. The fog began to clear, and I could see that we were no longer on Highway 58. We weren't on any highway that I recognized. The road beneath my wheels was older, narrower, and made of a type of asphalt that hadn't been used in decades. The landscape around us had changed too. Instead of the familiar desert scrub and rocky hills of the Mojave, we were driving through what looked like a residential neighborhood from the 1980s. Ranch-style houses with perfect lawns, station wagons in driveways, children's bicycles left carelessly on sidewalks. But everything was wrong. The houses were too dark, the lawns were too green, and there were no people anywhere. It was like driving through a movie set, a carefully constructed replica of suburban American life, with all the actual life sucked out of it. "We're almost home," the little girl said, her voice now coming from right behind my ear, even though I could still see her translucent form in the rearview mirror. "We can see our house. It's the blue one with the white shutters, just like we left it." I looked ahead and saw the house she was describing, a modest ranch home that stood out from the others because it was the only one with lights in the windows. Warm, yellow light that looked welcoming and normal, except for the fact that it was the only sign of life in this entire ghostly neighborhood. As we approached the house, I began to understand what they wanted from me. This wasn't just about giving them a ride. This was about completing their interrupted journey home, about finishing something that death had prevented them from finishing 37 years ago. And somehow, I was supposed to be the instrument of that completion. But I also understood with a growing sense of dread that once they were home, once their journey was complete, I wouldn't be needed anymore. And I was starting to suspect that the other drivers who had helped families like this one before me hadn't survived the experience. The truck rolled to a stop in the driveway of the blue house with white shutters, and I felt the engine shut down even though I hadn't turned the key. The silence was absolute and suffocating. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke. Then the man said, "Thank you, Mr. Harris. You've been more helpful than you know." I heard the sounds of movement from the sleeper compartment. the sounds of 3 people preparing to get out of the truck. But when I turned around to look at them, they weren't there. The sleeper compartment was empty, as if they had never been there at all. But I could still hear their voices, and now they seemed to be coming from outside the truck. I looked through the passenger side window and saw them standing in the driveway, looking exactly as they had when I'd first picked them up, except that they were no longer trying to appear human. They were translucent and shimmering, like heat mirages, and I could see the garage door right through their bodies. The little girl waved at me, a cheerful gesture that was somehow more terrifying than anything that had happened during the drive. "Thank you for bringing us home, Mr. Harris," she called out. "We couldn't have done it without you." The man walked to the driver's side of the truck and looked up at me through the window. His perfect smile was gone, replaced by an expression of cold satisfaction. "You can go now," he said. But there was something in his tone that suggested I wouldn't be going anywhere. "Unless, of course, you'd like to stay. There's always room for one more in our little family." I looked at the house and saw faces in the windows, other faces, the faces of people I didn't recognize, all of them pale and translucent and staring out at me with empty eyes. The other drivers, I realized. The ones who had helped other families reach their destinations over the years. They were all still here, trapped in the would start. That I would be able to leave this place and return to the real world. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even attempt to turn over. I tried again and again, but the truck was completely dead. I was stranded in the driveway of a house that shouldn't exist, in a neighborhood that was probably just a projection of memories and longing, with no way to escape and no way to call for help. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me when I was a kid. He'd been a trucker too, back in the days when drivers relied more on instinct and experience than on GPS and computer-assisted everything. He'd told me that there were places on America's highways where the normal rules didn't apply. Places where you could encounter things that weren't quite of this world. And he'd told me that the only way to escape such places was to refuse to play by their rules, to do something unexpected, something that would break whatever hold they had on you. So instead of continuing to try to start the truck, instead of getting out and walking toward the house like I felt compelled to do, I did something that went against every instinct of self-preservation I had. I put the truck in neutral and released the parking brake. Then, I opened the driver's side door and jumped out, rolling away from the truck as it began to roll backward down the sloped driveway toward the street. The family, or whatever they were, cried out in alarm as they realized what I was doing. The little girl's voice rose to a shriek. "You can't leave us! We're so close to being complete!" But I was already running, sprinting away from the house and the truck and the impossible neighborhood, running as fast as I could down a street that seemed to stretch on forever. Behind me, I could hear the sound of the truck picking up speed as it rolled backward, and then the tremendous crash as it slammed into something solid. The impact echoed through the ghostly suburb like thunder, and I felt a shockwave of energy that knocked me to my knees. When I looked back, the house was gone. The neighborhood was gone. I was kneeling on the shoulder of Highway 58 in the middle of the Mojave Desert, with the real lights of Barstow visible in the distance. My truck was about 100 yards behind me, jackknifed across both lanes of the highway, its cab separated from the trailer and smoking in the cool desert air. The fog had completely cleared, and I could see stars overhead, real stars, not the artificial lights of a phantom neighborhood. I must have lost consciousness after that, because the next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed in Barstow with a California Highway Patrol officer asking me questions about the accident. I told him the truth, or as much of the truth as I thought he would believe, about picking up hitchhikers in the fog and losing control of the truck. He seemed satisfied with that explanation, especially since single-vehicle accidents are unfortunately common on Highway 58, particularly in adverse weather conditions. The truck was a total loss, and I was lucky to be alive. The investigating officers said it looked like I deliberately jackknifed the vehicle, which didn't make sense from a mechanical standpoint, but was the only explanation that fit the physical evidence. They assumed I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and overcorrected when I woke up, which is a common cause of truck accidents. I didn't correct their assumption. How could I explain that I'd crashed my truck to escape from a family of ghosts who had been dead for 37 years? I spent the next week in the hospital recovering from a concussion and various cuts and bruises. And during that time, I did some research. I found the newspaper articles about the family that had died on Highway 58 in October of 1987. Robert and Margaret Chen and their 7-year-old daughter, Amy. They'd been driving to Barstow to visit Margaret's sister for Amy's birthday when their car skidded off the road in heavy fog. The articles mentioned that they'd been expected at the sister's house hours before the accident occurred, and that the family had called several times asking if they were all right. The official cause of the accident was determined to be driver fatigue, combined with reduced visibility. But I noticed that the articles also mentioned several reports from other drivers of a family seeking help on Highway 58 that same night. I found other articles too, scattered reports over the years of truck drivers who had claimed to pick up hitchhikers on Highway 58, only to arrive at truck stops or way stations with no memory of what had happened to their passengers. Most of these reports were dismissed as hallucinations brought on by fatigue, and the drivers who made them were often subjected to mandatory rest periods or psychological evaluations. But I knew better. I knew that Robert, Margaret, and Amy Chen had been collecting drivers for 37 years, using us to try to complete their interrupted journey home. When I was released from the hospital, Consolidated Freight Systems offered me another truck and a return to my regular route. I turned them down. I couldn't explain to them that I would never drive Highway 58 again, that I probably couldn't drive any highway at night without seeing those 3 faces in my rearview mirror. Instead, I told them I was retiring, that the accident had made me realize I was getting too old for long-haul driving. They gave me a decent severance package and a letter of recommendation, and I moved back to my hometown in Illinois to try to rebuild my life. But you can't really rebuild a life after experiencing something like that. You can't go back to believing that the world operates according to rational, predictable rules when you know that there are places where those rules don't apply, where the dead can hitchhike and time can run backward, like a roadmap from hell. I tried to get a job driving locally, but every time I got behind the wheel of any vehicle, even my own pickup truck, I would see Amy Chen's translucent face in the rearview mirror, staring at me with those dark, hungry eyes. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Sandra Martinez, who specialized in trauma recovery for accident survivors. I told her about the nightmares, about the insomnia, about my inability to drive after dark, but I didn't tell her about the ghosts. I didn't tell her that sometimes, late at night, I could hear Amy Chen's voice whispering my name from empty rooms in my house. I didn't tell her that I'd started sleeping with all the lights on because darkness reminded me too much of that fog on Highway 58. And I certainly didn't tell her that I believed Robert, Margaret, and Amy Chen were still out there, still waiting for the next trucker to show them kindness on a lonely desert highway. Dr. Martinez diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder and prescribed medication to help with the anxiety and depression. The medication helped with the panic attacks and made it easier to sleep, but it didn't make the memories go away. It didn't stop me from researching every unexplained truck accident on Highway 58 over the past 37 years, and it didn't stop me from finding patterns that suggested the Chen family had been far more successful at completing their journey than I had initially believed. There was the case of Thomas Bradley, a driver for Midwest Transport who disappeared in November of 1989. His truck was found abandoned near Barstow, engine running, logbook indicating that he had picked up passengers near the same location where I had encountered the Chen family. Thomas was never seen again, but there were reports from other drivers of seeing his truck on Highway 58 on foggy nights, always with passengers, always heading toward Barstow. Then there was Maria Santos, who vanished in March of 1993. Her truck was discovered overturned in a ditch about 10 miles from where Thomas Bradley's truck had been found. Maria's body was never recovered, but investigators found evidence that she had been carrying unauthorized passengers at the time of the accident. Witnesses at the last truck stop where she had been seen described seeing her talking to a family, a man, a woman, and a young girl, near the fuel pumps. The list went on. David Kim in 1996, Jennifer Walsh in 1998, Carlos Rodriguez in 2001, and at least a dozen others over the years. All of them experienced drivers with clean safety records, all of them lost on the same stretch of Highway 58, all of them carrying passengers who were never found. The official explanations varied: driver fatigue, mechanical failure, medical emergency, but the pattern was consistent. These missing drivers, offering my condolences and asking if their loved ones had ever mentioned anything unusual about Highway 58. Most of them thought I was a crank, another conspiracy theorist trying to make sense of senseless tragedies. But a few of them talked to me. David Kim's widow told me that her husband had called her from the road the night he disappeared, saying that he had picked up a family who needed help getting to Barstow. He'd sounded nervous, she said, not like himself at all. The last thing he'd said to her was, "Something's not right about these people, but I can't just leave them on the highway." Jennifer Walsh's brother told me that Jennifer had been driving the same route for 12 years without incident, and that she'd called him just hours before her disappearance to report strange malfunctions with her truck's electrical systems. She said the radio wasn't working right, he told me, and that her GPS was showing locations that didn't exist. She thought maybe she was getting sick, that she was hallucinating or something. Carlos Rodriguez's sister shared a voicemail that Carlos had left on her phone the night he vanished. I still have a recording of that voicemail, and listening to it gives me chills every time. Carlos's voice is shaky and frightened as he describes picking up a family that doesn't seem quite right, and feeling like his truck is driving itself toward Barstow. The message cuts off in the middle of a sentence, and Carlos was never heard from again. All of these drivers had experienced the same things I had experienced: the fog, the electrical malfunctions, the feeling of losing control of their vehicles. But unlike me, they hadn't been able to break free from whatever force had taken hold of them. They had become part of Robert, Margaret, and Amy Chen's extended family, trapped forever in service to ghosts who refused to accept their own death. I spent months trying to find some way to help these trapped souls, some way to break the cycle that had been repeating for 37 years. I contacted paranormal investigators, psychics, even a few priests who specialized in hauntings and possessions. Most of them thought I was delusional, but a few took my story seriously. Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest from Los Angeles who had experience with what he called unfinished business hauntings, listened to my entire story without interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time before he spoke. "What you're describing," he told me, "is a type of spiritual imprisonment that occurs when souls refuse to accept their death and become obsessed with completing some earthly task. The Chen family died before they could reach their destination, before little Amy could celebrate her birthday with her aunt's family. Their love for each other, combined with their desperate need to complete that journey, has created a kind of supernatural vortex that traps other souls in service to their obsession." Father O'Brien explained that the other drivers, Thomas Bradley, Maria Santos, David Kim, and the rest, were probably not dead in the conventional sense. They were trapped in what he called a liminal state, existing between life and death, unable to move on but also unable to return to the world of the living. The Chen family is using their life force, their spiritual energy, to maintain the illusion of completion, he said. They're playing house in a pocket dimension built from memory and longing, and they need living souls to keep that pocket dimension stable. The priest offered to perform an exorcism at the site where the Chen family had died, but he warned me that such a ritual might not be effective against spirits that had been growing stronger for nearly 4 decades. The longer a haunting persists, he explained, the more anchored it becomes to our physical reality. These ghosts have had 37 years to establish their presence on Highway 58. They've fed on the spiritual energy of dozens of drivers, and they've learned to manipulate the boundary between the living world and whatever realm they inhabit. I agreed to accompany Father O'Brien to the accident site, which was located about 15 miles east of Bakersfield, near mile marker 142 on Highway 58. We drove out there on a clear Thursday afternoon in late November, taking my pickup truck because I still couldn't bear the thought of being in another commercial vehicle. The site itself was unremarkable, just a steep embankment on the north side of the highway, marked by a small cross and some faded plastic flowers that someone had left years earlier. Father O'Brien spent about an hour walking around the area, praying in Latin and sprinkling holy water on the asphalt where the Chen family's car had left the roadway. I didn't feel anything unusual during the daylight hours, but as the sun began to set and the first wisps of evening fog started to form in the distance, the temperature began to drop noticeably. The priest seemed to sense it too, because he quickened his pace and began praying more urgently. That's when we heard a voice, Amy Chen's voice, calling out from somewhere in the gathering darkness. "Father, why are you trying to send us away? We just want to go home. We've been trying to go home for so long." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the rocky hills that flanked the highway. Father O'Brien continued his prayers, but I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold air. "We know you're here, Mr. Harris," Amy's voice continued, and now it sounded closer, more immediate. "We know you brought the priest to hurt us, but you can't hurt us. We are already dead. We died a long time ago, and all we want is to finish what we started." The fog was getting thicker, rolling across the highway in dense sheets that reduced visibility to just a few yards. I grabbed Father O'Brien's arm and suggested that we leave, but he shook his head and continued his ritual. "In the name of Jesus Christ," he called out, "I command you to release the souls you have imprisoned and to move on to your eternal rest." His voice was strong and authoritative, but Amy's laughter rang out in response. That same wind chime sound I remembered from my encounter with her in the truck. "Eternal rest is boring, Father," she replied. "We like it here. We like our new family. Mr. Bradley and Miss Santos and Mr. Kim and all the others, they're so much happier now that they don't have to worry about deadlines and delivery schedules. They get to play with me forever, and we get to go home whenever we want to." The fog had become so thick that I could barely see Father O'Brien, even though he was standing right next to me. I could hear other voices now, adult voices that I recognized as Robert and Margaret Chen. They were speaking in unison, their words overlapping in an eerie harmony. "This is our place, priest. This highway belongs to us now. We've claimed it through blood and sorrow and 37 years of waiting. You have no power here." Father O'Brien raised his voice, reciting what sounded like an exorcism prayer, but his words seemed to be absorbed by the fog without making any impact. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see our breath forming crystals in the air. That's when the headlights appeared, Truck headlights, approaching from the west at a speed that seemed impossibly fast for the thick fog. The truck roared past us, so close that I could feel the wind displacement from its passage, and I caught a glimpse of the driver in the cab. It was Thomas Bradley, the first driver who had disappeared on this stretch of highway in 1989. His face was pale and translucent, his eyes empty and staring, and he was gripping the steering wheel with hands that looked more like claws than fingers. In the passenger seat, I could see the shadowy forms of the Chen family, and little Amy waved at me as the truck disappeared into the fog. "They're showing off," Father O'Brien said grimly. "They want us to know that they're in control here, that our presence is just another form of entertainment for them." He packed up his holy water and his prayer book, and we retreated to my pickup truck. As we drove away from the accident site, I could hear Amy's voice one last time, carried on the wind. "Come back and visit us soon, Mr. Harris. We miss you." The exorcism had been a complete failure, and Father O'Brien admitted that he was out of his depth when it came to dealing with spirits that had accumulated so much power over such a long period of time. "I'm sorry, Matthew," he told me as we parted ways. "There are some hauntings that are beyond the reach, and that you want other drivers to do the same. But how do you warn people about something like this? How do you tell fellow truckers that there's a stretch of highway in California where the dead hitchhike, and time runs backward, and good Samaritans disappear forever? Most people would think you were crazy, and those who didn't would probably assume you were just trying to scare them with campfire stories. The trucking industry runs on pragmatism and skepticism, not ghost stories and supernatural warnings. I tried posting warnings on trucker forums and CB radio channels, describing the danger in vague terms and advising drivers to avoid picking up hitchhikers on Highway 58. Some people took my warnings seriously, but others dismissed them as the ravings of someone who had been traumatized by an accident. A few drivers even accused me of trying to spread panic for my own twisted amusement. The worst part was that I continued to find evidence that the Chen family's collection was still growing. Every few months, there would be another report of a missing truck driver, another unexplained accident on Highway 58, another family left wondering what had happened to their loved one. I started keeping a file of newspaper clippings and incident reports documenting each new disappearance and looking for patterns that might help me understand how the Chen family selected their victims. It seemed that they preferred lone drivers, men and women who traveled the highways without partners or co-drivers. They also seemed to target drivers with clean safety records, people who were known for their professionalism and reliability. Most importantly, they chose drivers who had reputations for being helpful to stranded motorists, people who were likely to stop and offer assistance to a family in need. In other words, they preyed on the best qualities of the trucking community: compassion, reliability, and the willingness to help fellow travelers in distress. About 8 months after my encounter with the Chen family, I received a call from Detective Susan Rodriguez of the California Highway Patrol. She had been investigating a series of missing trucker cases and had come across my name in connection with the accident report from my crash on Highway 58. She wanted to know if I had any information that might help with her investigation. I met with Detective Rodriguez at a truck stop near Bakersfield, and I told her everything. I expected her to laugh at me or suggest that I seek professional help, but instead she listened carefully and took detailed notes. When I finished my story, she was quiet for a long time before she spoke. "Mr. Harris," she said, "I've been investigating unusual incidents on Highway 58 for the past 5 years, ever since I was assigned to this area. I've documented 17 cases of missing truck drivers, all of whom were last seen on the same stretch of highway where you had your accident. I've also received dozens of reports from other drivers who claim to have had strange experiences on that road. Electrical malfunctions, time distortions, encounters with hitchhikers who disappeared without explanation. Detective Rodriguez opened a thick file folder and showed me photographs, witness statements, and incident reports that documented a pattern of supernatural activity that stretched back decades. Officially, she told me, these are all classified as either driver error or unexplained disappearances. But unofficially, I've been building a case that something unusual is happening on that highway, something that can't be explained by conventional law enforcement methods. She had interviewed the families of missing drivers, just as I had, and she had uncovered the same pattern of last-minute phone calls, describing strange passengers and malfunctioning equipment. She had also documented several cases of drivers who had reported picking up a family on Highway 58, only to arrive at their destinations with no memory of what had happened to their passengers and no explanation for missing time or altered routes. The problem, Detective Rodriguez explained, is that I can't build a prosecutable case against ghosts. I can't arrest the supernatural or issue warrants for spirits. All I can do is document what's happening and try to warn people to stay away from that area. She had tried working with state highway officials to post warning signs or increase police patrols, but her superiors were reluctant to take action based on what they considered to be folklore and superstition. Detective Rodriguez and I began working together to document new incidents and warn potential victims. We created a network of truck stops and CB radio channels that would spread warnings about Highway 58, and we encouraged drivers to travel that route in convoys whenever possible. Our efforts had some success. Several drivers reported avoiding that stretch of highway after hearing our warnings, and there seemed to be a temporary decrease in disappearances during the winter of 2024. But the Chen family was not content to let their hunting ground be compromised. In February of 2025, the disappearances resumed with a vengeance. 3 drivers vanished in a single week. All of them experienced professionals who had been warned about the dangers of Highway 58, but had been forced to travel that route due to delivery schedules or company policies. It became clear that Robert, Margaret, and Amy Chen were becoming more aggressive in their collection methods, perhaps sensing that their secret was beginning to leak into the wider world. That's when I made the decision to go public with my story. Detective Rodriguez warned me that doing so would probably end any credibility I had left with the trucking industry, and that it might expose me to ridicule or even legal action from people who thought I was spreading harmful misinformation. But I realized that my credibility didn't matter anymore. What mattered was warning many drivers as possible about the danger that waited on Highway 58. I want to be clear about something. I am not making this story up. I am not trying to entertain you or frighten you for the sake of frightening you. I am trying to save lives. If you are a truck driver, or if you know someone who is, please share this video. Please spread the word about Highway 58 between Bakersfield and Barstow. Please tell people to avoid picking up hitchhikers on that stretch of road. No matter how desperate those hitchhikers might seem, the Chen family is still out there. Robert, Margaret, and little Amy are still waiting in the fog for the next kind-hearted driver to offer them assistance. They are still collecting souls to add to their ghostly family, still playing house in their pocket dimension built from memory and longing. And they are still growing stronger with each victim they claim. I know that some of you watching this will think I'm crazy. I know that my story sounds impossible, that it challenges everything you believe about how the world works. But I also know that somewhere out there, probably tonight, another driver is going to see 3 figures standing on the shoulder of Highway 58, and they're going to make the same compassionate decision that I made 3 months ago. They're going to stop and offer help to a family in need. And unless something changes, unless enough people hear this warning and spread it to others, That driver is going to disappear, just like Thomas Bradley and Maria Santos and David Kim and all the others. They're going to become another ghost in the Chen family's collection, trapped forever in service to spirits who refuse to accept their own death. I don't sleep well anymore. I can't drive at night, and I probably never will again. I take medication for anxiety and depression, and I see a therapist twice a week to help me process the trauma of that night. But despite all of that, despite the fact that my encounter with the Chen family has essentially ruined my life, I consider myself lucky. I'm lucky because I escaped. I'm lucky because I'm still alive, still human, still able to warn others about what's waiting on Highway 58. If you take nothing else from this video, take this. Kindness and compassion are beautiful qualities, but they can also make you vulnerable to forces that want to exploit your goodness for their own purposes. The Chen family counts on finding drivers who are decent, caring people, because those are the drivers most likely to stop and offer help to strangers. Don't stop. Don't pick up hitchhikers on Highway 58. No matter who they are or how desperate they seem. Don't trust families with no luggage and pristine clothes who claim to have been walking for hours. Don't trust passengers who cast no reflection in your mirrors, or children whose voices seem to come from everywhere at once. And if you ever find yourself driving with static and your GPS stops working, if you begin to feel like you're not in control of your own vehicle, get off the highway immediately. Pull over, call for help, do whatever you have to do to get away from Highway 58. Because once the Chen family gets you in their truck, once they start their journey toward a home that exists only in their memories and their longing, there may be no way back to the world of the living. You'll become another ghost driver, another soul trapped in service to the dead, another member of a family that should have moved on to whatever comes after life, but chose instead to remain anchored to a stretch of California highway where the fog rolls in and time moves backward, and the dead refuse to stay dead. This is Matthew Harris, and this is my story. I hope you never have a story like it to tell. I hope you never have to experience what I experienced on that foggy night in October. But if you do, if you ever find yourself facing something that shouldn't exist, something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world, remember that you have choices. Remember that you can fight back. Remember that sometimes the only way to escape from the supernatural is to do something completely unexpected, something that breaks the rules they're trying to impose on you. The Chen family is still out there, still waiting, still collecting, but now you know they're there. Now you've been warned. And maybe, just maybe, that warning will be enough to save your life. Thank you for watching Horror Silence. Please subscribe and share this video if you think it might help someone else avoid the fate that befell so many drivers before me. And remember, some roads are not meant to be traveled, especially not alone, and especially not at night. Highway 58 is one of those roads. Stay safe out there. And if you're ever driving through California and you see 3 figures standing on the shoulder of the highway asking for help, keep driving. Just keep driving and don't look back.